All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're taking what might honestly feel like a pretty dense subject, the environmental management system under the ISO 14001:2026 standard, and we're going to see how to actually turn it into a vibrant, living framework. We're going to look at the massive structural difference between a system that, merely looks good on paper versus one that genuinely drives operational excellence. So let me ask you this. Is your environmental management system just some dusty binder sitting on a shelf somewhere? Or is it a living, breathing system that's truly embedded in your daily operations? Source material frequently points to what lead auditors call the audit trap, and this is where organizations fail. Not because they don't have good intentions, but because their documentation is just completely disconnected from their operational reality. Basically, they've built an administrative silo instead of a functional tool. To help us avoid that trap, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, defining your EMS boundaries. Second, embedding the EMS into operations. Third, identifying significant environmental aspects. Fourth, the golden thread of traceability. And finally, demonstrating measurable outcomes. Okay, let's jump straight into Section 1, defining your EMS boundaries. Under Clause 4.3 of the standard, getting the scope of your system exactly right is literally the first, absolutely crucial step to avoid those costly and, let's face it, somewhat embarrassing audit failures. It's actually fascinating to realize that a boundary isn't just a physical building or a fence line around a factory. We really have to consider things like organizational divisions, operational processes, and functional decision-making. Think about a procurement department, for instance. They might just sit in a standard office building with very little direct environmental impact themselves, but their supplier selection criteria, that heavily influences the organization's overall environmental footprint. The scope ensures all these interconnected areas are systematically managed. And actually, this highlights a major red flag that auditors are constantly looking for: justified boundaries versus artificial exclusions. The guidance is super clear, warning against artificially limiting your scope just to make compliance a little easier. For example, you absolutely cannot deliberately exclude a high-emission distribution warehouse or a chemical storage facility from your EMS just to make the paperwork look clean. If the organization has control or even influence over an operation that generates significant environmental risks, it for sure needs to be inside that boundary. All right, moving right along to Section 2, embedding EMS into operations. This relates directly to Clause 4.4, which is all about ensuring the system is actually implemented and truly integrated. It's really like a funnel effect. A successful environmental system cannot be kept isolated in an administrative silo. What we need to see is a high-level boardroom policy that cascades seamlessly down into enterprise risk assessments, shapes procurement criteria, and eventually lands right on the clipboard of a technician as a daily maintenance protocol. The environmental responsibilities have to be distributed across all business functions. Which brings us to Section 3, identifying significant environmental aspects. Here we are at Clause 6.1, and this is where we get super granular. It's about finding those exact nodes where your business operations actively interact with the environment. So the absolute crucial point here is understanding the fundamental difference between an aspect and an impact in ISO terminology. An aspect is the interaction itself, say using a solvent or discharging wastewater. The impact, on the other hand, is the resulting change to the environment, like air pollution or the contamination of a local river. You have to identify both accurately. They are two halves of the same coin. But obviously, you can't tackle every single thing at once, right? That's exactly why we use significance weighting. By using this weighting system, we evaluate those aspects based on regulatory limits, the severity of the environmental damage, stakeholder concern, and the frequency of occurrence. This objective scoring is what ensures that high-risk areas like hazardous emissions or critical wastewater discharges are legally and properly prioritized way above less significant issues, like, say, office paper waste. Okay, now for my favorite part, Section 4, the golden thread of traceability. This concept right here is exactly what lead auditors are actively hunting for when they dive into your planning documentation. Picture this. A glowing digital thread traces a continuous line from a documented significant environmental aspect involving wastewater directly to a measurable water conservation objective, demonstrating perfect objective-to-aspects traceability. What this really means is that your objectives aren't just random feel-good goals picked out of thin air. No, they are strategically derived from your highest evaluated risks. To see exactly how this glowing thread works in practice, let's start at the source with our aspect, wastewater discharge. Now, let's say this was scored as highly significant. We trace that directly to the impact, potential water contamination. Then, we follow the thread even further to the objective, a 15% reduction in chemical discharge. When an auditor is evaluating your system, they pull on this exact thread. They want to see proof that an abstract policy has genuinely become a concrete, traceable action plan targeting actual operational realities. And that leads us perfectly into Section 5, demonstrating measurable outcomes. We're looking at Clause 6.2 now, which is the final destination of our digital thread. And the standards guidance gives us a pretty stark warning here. It basically says that vague goals like improve sustainability will straight up fail audits. Good intentions are essentially audit traps. The updated ISO 14001 standard demands objective, hard data. If a goal simply states a desire to reduce environmental impact, an auditor is immediately going to ask, okay, by how much, by when, and compared to what baseline? That is exactly why your target metric must be hyper-specific, like a firm 15% reduction. Quantifiable targets are literally the only acceptable proof of compliance. An objective has to clearly define the what, the who, the how, and the when. You absolutely need hard numbers to prove that your management system is actually managing something. To prove those verifiable results, you've got to establish your baseline data, like your baseline water discharge, and then compare it directly against your target water discharge. Having this crystal clear comparison proves that an environmental initiative isn't just some nice theory, it's producing verifiable, measured results. Because let's be real, if there is no baseline, you simply cannot prove improvement. But the story doesn't just end when you hit that 15% reduction. ISO 14001 fundamentally requires continual improvement. That means the system must continuously adapt for better performance as targets are met, as new technologies like, say, better filtration systems become available, and as operational conditions inevitably evolve. The system must continuously push the envelope for better environmental performance. So I want to leave you with this one thought to chew on today. If an auditor walked in and pulled the thread on your highest environmental risk right now, where exactly would it lead? Would it lead to a clear, measurable objective and tight operational controls? Or would that thread just snap, breaking off into vague intentions and artificial boundaries? It is definitely worth taking a hard look into your own EMS traceability today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.